It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the most exciting session of these 2 days, this session on agroforestry. I'm your host, I'm Patrick Worms, I'm the Senior Science Policy Advisor of World Agroforestry, which is a research institution with about 700 researchers and other staff headquartered in both Nairobi, Kenya and Bogor, Indonesia. As you can guess, they mostly look at tropical agroforestry systems. But I'm also the president of the European Agroforestry Federation, which is a grouping of national agroforestry institutions from across Europe, including, I must add today, from Ukraine, and we are all thinking of our Ukrainian colleagues in this hard time. Before we move to our exciting speakers, let me just remind us what agroforestry is. At its simplest, agroforestry means mixing things up, adding trees to annual crops or trees to grasslands in order to achieve certain effects. What kind of effects? Well, first you have ecosystemic effects. Tree roots are much deeper than crop roots or grass roots, and so they pump up nutrients and water from deep in the soil to make their leaves and to make their branches. When these leaves and these branches fall back onto the soil surface and rot, they provide nutrition to the grasses or to the crops, and thus to the products that humans are interested in. They also provide protection against strong winds, which in the case of big plains like in Ukraine or Russia or the American Midwest, will reduce evapotranspiration and so help crops grow faster, will increase the protein content in your grain head. They also buffer you against droughts. You have that effect of distributed shade, you have that effect of reducing wind, and that helps maintain moisture in the landscape. You have effects that are positive on pests and diseases, because after all, what are pests but insects that are free to rampage across a monoculture? If you have trees there, trees usually host quite a lot of birds, and quite a few birds love to eat insects. So you have a way of controlling pests naturally. In practice, agroforestry means bringing the ecosystemic processes that mean that natural savannas or natural forests are so productive back into the farming system. And lastly, and from the perspective of the many foresters that hear us today, most interesting is that agroforestry is a wonderful way of growing an enormous amount of fresh woody biomass for timber, for paper, for fiber, for other applications. The amount of trees that could be added to farming systems in Europe alone is breathtaking, somewhere between 3 and 100 billion trees, depending on how you run the models. And all it would take is for farmers to add alleys into their farming systems. They would continue to use the same machinery, they would continue planting the same crops, they would continue operating the same farming system, with the added benefit of a little bit of extra resilience and a ka-chunk moment after the rotation of the trees is over, when you harvest that timber, can sell it on the open market and make a nice little income. Just to give you an idea, before I pass it on to my colleagues, about how efficient agroforestry is, in one 40-year-long experiment in southwest France, where they measured the total woody productivity of a freshly planted walnut forest and a freshly planted walnut agroforestry system, the total wood produced after 40 years was the same in both, even though in the agroforestry system, only 20% of the surface was devoted to trees and 80% was devoted to crops. That's why I like to say that foresters are generally leaving a lot of money on the table by not planting anything between their trees, and farmers are at the mercy of the wild price swings of yearly crop and not doing anything for their pension by not planting trees. That's the overview. But now let's look at these things in more detail. And we're going to be looking at these things with Willy Smits, and Willy, who is doing the almost miraculous. He's trying to figure out how at very large scale to get commodity traders, off-takers, to work with thousands of smallholders, not just to add one type of tree in the landscape, but to maintain a thriving, biodiverse, carbon-absorbing agricultural system that could be the way to the future. Stephanie is operating in two areas and indeed on two continents and is focusing on a different kind of commodity, coffee, amongst other things, and will be telling us about that. Oliver is doing something else. Oliver is with an organization called 123, and Oliver is the guy who's running around the planet trying to find good projects that could be increased with a little bit of business advice or a little bit of extra capital. The mission that Oliver has is to ensure that we move away from these monocultures, these large monoclonal plantations of trees, to more complex systems. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that Oliver, Willie, and Stephanie are all part of the solution. And with that, I'd like to ask, ladies first, Stephanie, to tell us a little bit about the lessons that she has learned in her project. But before that, perhaps you could explain your business in a few words to our audience. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I'm Stephanie Race. I'm the founder and CEO of Earth Labs Group. And Earth Labs Group is a company that I started actually 13 years ago in California. And we've evolved from an agrotechnology business to environmental monitoring of landscape scale ecosystem services. Today, we're going to talk about two of our projects. One in North Sumatra that's focused on regenerative palm, which in of itself is transitioning from a monoculture to a mixed farming system that one could characterize as agroforestry. And the second is a series of projects that we're doing in Panama that's focused on transitioning monoculture coffee to an agroforestry system. I'll just premise a couple of my comments before I bring up my slide to talk about the two projects that there's been a lot of discussion over the past 24 hours in this meeting about the need to monitor, verify, and report the externalities associated with carbon, water, and biodiversity. And just to pick up on Patrick's comments a moment ago about the value of trees, planting trees for planting trees' sake is not what this is about. This is about how to use the benefits of woody perennials, and those could be small trees, they could be bushes, they could be trees intermixed with such perennial crops to essentially increase water holding capacity, increase carbon sequestration, and increase biodiversity in a meaningful way to produce economic value in these landscapes and livelihoods for smallholder farmers. So in terms of how do we accelerate the benefits that we talk about as it relates to environmental services in both the agriculture and forestry context, I think agroforestry presents the right set of use cases to do both things at the same time. Now, before I bring up my slide, I'm going to make 3 points and I guess sort of an overall comment. When I went back to the literature to say, you know, we have scientists on our team that work on tree diseases. We have scientists on our team that have been working on coffee and tea for 40 years. What is it about these farming systems that makes them unique? And when we went back to it, we looked at, you know, forests combined with farming could be grazing with trees. It could be farming with trees. This could be done in a temperate landscape, like in the Northern Hemisphere in Western Europe or Eastern Europe, or even in North America, or it could be done in tropical landscapes. And we're going to focus the discussion today on tropical landscapes, but I think it's important to look at everything's place-based, and agroforestry is a fantastic reflection of that in terms of how do we create the right diversification of species, both plants as well as animals, if you want to graze in an agroforestry system that ties the microbiology of soils all the way back to people. So it's the perfect use case, if you will, for describing how regeneration works to bring these environmental services to forest and farming landscapes quickly.
Stephanie,
so I'm going to bring up
your question.
Sure, go ahead.
Your question.
Yeah.
I think we're all convinced here. We're all true believers. We know it's great for ecosystem services, for biodiversity, and for carbon. But industry needs to make money. How can you make money from these complex systems? And how do you, in particular with these projects, make money from these complex systems?
I think it's a very interesting question. Agroforestry for years, I think, has been considered something for rich people to do, almost like hobby farming or something for smallholders to do because they already have diversified landscapes. And now all these large food and fiber companies in the apparel industry are saying they're going to move to regenerative supply chains and they care about smallholder farmers. So it brings all of this back into focus to say, how can you make a commercial go at this? And it's not so much about transitioning traditional plantation crops to a mixed system, although that's what I'm going to talk about in just a moment. It's also about how do you add trees to arable agriculture and start to diversify both what you're growing as well as the income streams. So there's been a lot of discussion prior to today's session on carbon, the value of carbon, and how do we do all this. What we found in terms of markets for externalities versus markets for, how would I say this, traditional timber and agricultural commodities is we have to do both. And agroforestry is a perfect way to diversify income streams, as well as the things that are produced from a landscape. And I'll go in and show how this works. And in the context of implementation, it basically means the supply chains of the corporate food and beverage companies need to rethink how they're doing sourcing. So working together as a collaboration so that they can essentially be working off of the same landscape. So it's a whole new way of thinking about global sourcing for large companies such as Nestle, Unilever, et cetera.
And you are optimistic that this will work, because after all, this is going to increase somebody's costs.
We're trying. We've been working on this for 13 years. I know you've been doing agroforestry much longer, but from a commercial point of view, the driver for this is really having something to say about environmental benefits in the supply chain and tying that back to future-proofing the availability of these commodities for these companies to stay viable. You know, when we talk about climate change and biodiversity collapse, it's not just a bunch of happy words. It's quantified in real financial terms, in terms of risk and value. And I think our customers, which represent some of the top 50 food companies in the world, are all grappling with these issues. I think agroforestry, there's a lot of discussion about it. It's hard to do. The other two speakers will talk about their successes in scaling some of these things and how do we get there quickly. I think, you know, the transformation of the food systems inextricably linked to getting this all to work, because we can't do it all off of the backs of forest carbon projects for carbon markets. It's got to be integrated back to the transformation of the food system. So yes, yeah, so how does it work? It's going to take time, but we have to push. This is a great opportunity to make it happen.
You're absolutely right, Stephanie, in particular when you say we have to do both. We have to have the off-takers for these products, and we also have to make money from the externalities, the positive externalities that we generate this way. Still, we are going to be facing some problems, and Willie, I'll ask you to focus on those, which is that you know, an organization like Unilever buys up about 2% of the globe's agricultural and fiber production. And if you are the purchasing manager, it's a lot easier to deal with one guy who has 100,000 hectares of some commodities than to deal with 100,000 farmers, each of which have 1 hectare producing 15 different wonderful commodities. So how do we get scale without always simplifying landscapes? That's the question that I'd like us all to explore. And to help us do that, Willie, perhaps you can tell us how you are managing this in the Indonesian context in which you operate. Willie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Yeah, so I'm the Chief Science Officer of the Arsari Enviro Industry Group, which is a group that controls about 700,000 hectares of land, degraded forests in Indonesia. And I've been in Indonesia for the last 43 years. I was for a long time in the government, responsible for conservation and reforestation, written lots of technical manuals, trained over 1,000 foresters. But the real key is, if you look at the farmer systems, they have very good systems that work, traditional. So traditional agroforestry is great, but how to scale it up is indeed the issue. So what I have been working on is how to integrate both these small scale approaches with the very large scale. And that is going to take an integration, first of all, looking at ecology. So we are doing a much better job on species site matching, bringing species together that are synergistic for each other, but also to do the combination of species that have a market and also that actually fulfill local needs. So it is an integration of many of those components. And then you need a big off-taker that is going to provide the sustainable income. In our case, it is from the biomass conversion to biofuels. And we are working with a company called Lanzatech, and they can use syngas, which can be made from basically any waste organic material. And that can be fermented by anaerobic bacteria directly into ethanol, but very soon also into a whole range of other products that will allow sustainable fuel for airplanes or methanol for boats. So it's those new conversion methodologies that are really the key element to have a large off-taker where you can bring in the main commercial product. So our methodology, we call it Rebuild. It is based upon the utilization of biomass from the burned forests. 1998, we had massive fires in our area, 5.5 million hectares just around the area where I'm working. And in our area, 70% of it got destroyed. What we are now doing is saving the forest that is still in good condition, and that is going to be preserved for carbon offsets, but also for non-timber forest product collection and collection of dead wood to be converted into biochar. Biochar is an important component to have a yearly adding of permanent carbon to the soil, which is a aromatic carbon, not a linear carbon, so produced at high temperatures, and that is really going to last for a much longer time. Then the recipes that we make, maybe I can share a slide and show what we are trying to achieve is here. I hope you can see my screen. Let me put it. So we are working with the company to do the monitoring. Transparency is going to be the key. And this integrated program is taking place in East Kalimantan on the coast of the island of Borneo. And we have an area which is not burned, and that is where the dipterocarp forest is surviving, where we are yielding resins, where we can yield dead biomass. And then there is this vast area of burned over forest where we have secondary forest which has reached its maximum volume and is now actually dying off and emitting carbon dioxide to the air. And the way how we deal with it is that we first...
A quick question, really, on the slides. A quick question on the slides. If you could go back to the previous slide.
Yes.
The picture you show of the secondary forest is a classic successional stage. One would expect scientifically that if you leave it alone, it would go back to the dipterocarp forest that was there before.
Very good
maybe
question.
Over 10 years, maybe over 50 years. My question is, how have you established that this is actually now beginning to die back and again emitting carbon into the atmosphere?
Because of the volume that we have measured. So we have collected really 100% of the litter, of the roots, of every branch, every stem, every dead piece of material, every liana was weighed and dry weight was determined. So we are actually monitoring this. We are also running the longest running biomass and growth and yield plots of Southeast Asia since 1976 in this area where we have the accurate data. So I'll be happy to talk more in detail on that in another time.
We probably don't need to go into the technicalities, but I'm glad that you are measuring it, and presumably that's published information and it could be shared with myself or with a group later.
Yes, we have a clearinghouse of growth and yield data that can be shared. Of those plots, the latest biomass measurements that are going into detail and looking at the amount of biochar, etc., that will be published in the coming months, hopefully, and then try to do that in reference journals.
Thank you. Do please proceed.
So the way that we deal with it is that we have now this very low quality, low value secondary forest species of very few species. And to answer your question, there are no dipterocarps left in it. The whole area has been burned so intensively that there are no more sources of the natural material. If you go for these, no regeneration possible. We have an area of forest near the city of Balikpapan where for 100 years the same type of forest has been maintained. It has never reached more than 50% of the biomass of that original forest. So this is a dead-end road, and it's those low-quality trees that we are now replacing with a variety of different tree species intermixed with crops. the key, if you look at these recipes, is that you do a first-time harvesting, which gives you an instant income thanks to this transformative technology of converting biomass to usable energy, 2G fuels, and that you can mix the species in such a way that they match the soil, the climate, the steepness of the slope, but also always provide the right incentives for nutrient retention, the job opportunities, food security, and that you look at markets, marketability of the product. So even the non-timber forest products, that forest basket is providing a huge amount of income. Now, this has been analyzed through McKinsey, that was paid by the Norwegian government to do an assessment of our system, the rebuild system, and they came up with IRRs of 28 to 31%. So yes, it is very complicated. You need to deal with lots of people. You're going to need a training facility. We are also working with some 150 different species, which is not an easy thing to do. So there is a big investment needed. And the most important investment is getting the trust of the people, that they are willing to cooperate. And that is what we do by providing them a whole range of very useful facilities. So we do the matching, we look at soil types, we look at slopes, we look at the existing vegetation classes, and then we take out the areas that are too steep, the riverine zones, we take out the rock, we leave whatever bit of forest is good, we create wildlife corridors, we then only plan the infrastructure so that people can do it in a traditional way, like a village, to access those pieces of land where they are working. And then you can end up with a mixture of a conservation area and production area. And the people can have all these benefits of the income as long as they stick to protecting that conservation. So it's an integration of conservation project with reforestation through agroforestry. And then
Willie,
you only lay out your recipes.
Willie, I'm going to speed you up. I'm going to speed you up a little bit because we don't have that much time, and I want all of you to discuss with one another. What you're describing sounds almost like perfection.
I hope so.
When somebody, if I were to buy a used car and somebody is telling me this used car is great, I would ask, where's the catch? From your perspective, what's the downside of this? Is there any downside to this model? Have you begun to identify problems that you wished you had learned about earlier?
This is the problem. You need to give people something that makes it worth for them. And you have to give them a fair deal. Now, this has been the biggest thing. So if I present this program to investors, they want to do the cherry picking. They say, we don't need to pay them that much money, So there has to be a deal that, sure, you can invest, but you have to take the total package, including all the ethical requirements that we are putting in for this. So you have to have the willingness of the farmers to commit to the package deal. You need the transparency, including very frequent independent monitoring, which we do through our cooperation partnership with Space for Good, which is also the sponsor of this session. And you need to set up this infrastructure to continuously and timely transport, track, and process the various products from the separate units. And only when you have these thousands of units, you have a constant flow of product. But without the infrastructure investment of processing that in a timely way and in the most optimal way, it's not going to work. So that is really what I believe is the key if we want to try to find solutions through agroforestry.
Willie, you certainly convinced me. I would invest. Oliver, do you share that assessment? Over to you, because your job is to allocate capital in ways that square the circle between making the planet a better place, but also getting some return in. Tell us how you do that.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think I have to congratulate Willie on a highly complex but fascinating project. So I wish you all the best with this. I mean, you're in the midst of it, but obviously that is a lifelong challenge, it looks like. A great project. Yes, so let me talk quickly about 1 to 3, 1 minute, just to put that into context, because we collated already quite a few points that I've tried to connect here. So 1 to 3 is a relatively young company, has been established in 2016, and as you say, has made itself the mission to find and allocate large-scale institutional capital into the space of agroforestry systems, farming under regenerative farming principles, transforming conventional farming into biodiverse production systems, and to do it at scale, to prove that these kind of investments can be just as profitable, but from a risk perspective, much better diversified than conventional farming has been and still is, obviously, and to make it the new norm, basically. So good luck with that. Obviously, it needs much more than us, but there is a lot of capital around, and that capital needs proof points that this transition can happen now and that it can happen at scale, and that basically is our mission. So what we've done so far is to be very active in particular in Mesoamerica, in Latin America, and we have developed 12 projects so far that focus on, well, a wide range of crops, but we have certain core crops where we have a lot of knowledge around, which is in particular cocoa, coffee, and coconut. So those are our 3 C's. But acting in agroforests, of course, there's a lot of other things that we produce: tropical fruit, natural oils, and so on, that we commercialize either locally, regionally, or with large off-takers, and we touched upon that when with the other 2 in this call. So it's what Willie says. It's an amazing project, fascinating. And people love to cherry pick. They look at that and they say, like, wow, right, that's a great landscape effort, and I would like to build a very profitable plantation in the middle of it. And then we need to find some public sector funding to take care of all the rest, basically, you know. And that is something
that is always the problem, isn't it? The cherry picking. The capitalists want to go in there and mess the landscape up with a big plantation and let the public sector take care of these peons, these little farmers. I'm belaboring the point here. How do you solve that particular issue? We all face it. How do you solve it at 1, 2, 3?
Well, in principle, look, I mean, you probably do need the big farms, but for a number of reasons. One is those kind of investments, and you touched upon that when discussing with Stephanie, they are quite expensive. You know, building an agroforestry system is more expensive than building, let's say, a perennial crop monoculture, and certainly much more expensive than a row crop system, you know.
Take us through that. Tell us why it's more expensive than to do monocrop perennials or monocrop plantation, crop plantation.
Well, I mean, Stephanie said, that's a very important point. Successful agroforests are extremely site-specific, right? So you cannot design let's say, the standard template that you roll out then across the globe, basically. You have to look at the site that you have at hand. You have to understand the topography. You have to understand the climate you're acting in, and then design an you can have a standard modules, basically. And you know that, Patrick, we talked about that quite a bit, like sort of go back to your building blocks, your core building blocks that you use time and again, basically. But you'll always have to adapt it to a particular site. You have to design it in a way that you're...
Any farm or any plantation would have to do that, whether it's planting one thing or 2 or 3 or 4.
That is true, but it gets even more complex with the agroforest. So you said the different plants in the system, they have different functional roles. Well, that is true, but if you just say, like, look, we only grow coffee under shade, well, that may be very successful in some areas, but due to different radiation levels, it may not be particularly successful in other areas. So it looks nicer, but it may not be particularly successful. So in some areas, you may decide against that and focus on other measures
So the initial investment costs will be somewhat higher than they would be in monocropping systems, but presumably you're doing it because over time you expect a higher return on that investment.
That is certainly the case. I mean, first of all, you're flattening the curve to an extent because you are producing several cash crops, ideally in the system, which means you have exposure to several markets rather than just one market. And what's that one market? If you have a high yield, a bumper yield in a very good, let's say you go anti-cyclical, then you're a very happy person, but in the next year you may be a very unhappy person. Whereas if you diversify with spices, with tubers, then you may still be a bit unhappy that your cocoa or coffee market currently isn't that great, but you can mitigate the effects of that through
So
other markets.
You get that economic resilience because
you have that economic resilience, absolutely. You flatten basically your income curve. And secondly, I think it's been proven in a number of studies now that overall yields are superior in agroforests than they are in monocrops over time. So what's that initial investment from planning, from develop a hectare of a good agroforest? That doesn't happen in one season. Basically, you have to plant it in sequence. The shade crops obviously have to be there to develop shade before they can put shade on other crops. So you have to think about it basically, and your agroforestry system is maybe completed after 3 planting cycles, let's say, and still has to develop then. And then you start at some point to take out certain plants because they used up their function in the system. You can commercialize them, but also you need to remove them in any case because they may turn from a support to a hindrance and so on. So it's something that needs constant care. And that
Oliver,
makes it more expensive.
Would it be fair to say, to use a musical metaphor, that a monocrop farm or a monocrop plantation is like somebody playing the piano or somebody playing the violin, but an agroforestry system is like a symphony orchestra conductor. You are having all of the pieces working together in harmony.
That's true, and that's also the challenge, because you cannot simply tell all the surrounding small farmers, well, just do what we do, right? Because we got a team of 20 very well-educated technical staff who are constantly looking at everything, discussing everything in meetings, and ultimately come up with a hopefully perfect system. So you got to reduce it to the max, as one of my previous bosses used to say, and identify those measures that really have a strong impact. And they may not deliver the perfect result overall, but they can certainly have a strong benefit to the farmers in the surroundings.
Thanks, Oliver. I'm going to speed you up because we have very little time left and we have a lot of questions from the audience. But I would still say, it's not about having the 20 highly credentialed experts from universities. I warmly recommend this book if you're dealing with tropical forest systems. Charles M. Peters is a tropical forester. He's been doing it for 30 years, and this is a summary of his experiences. And Willie, you'd be interested in hearing that in there he says that the Dayak in Sumatra are the best foresters in the world, full stop. The way that they manage the landscapes is breathtakingly elegant and provides with a lot of high quality products. So perhaps the solution also is not to tell the little farmers what to do, but to learn from the little farmers about what works in that particular context. Yes, again, it increases the upfront investment costs, but does it not improve the likelihood of success over the long term? First, Stephanie.
I'd like to comment to that, Patrick.
Yeah. First, Stephanie, Willie, then Oliver. Stephanie.
Thank you. I think what you just said in terms of the two-way communication, particularly in indigenous landscapes, we've had experience all the way from the San Luis Valley to the Klamath Basin in the United States, to the work we're doing in North Sumatra, to the project that we're doing in Panama on coffee. And in every instance, we have a top team of 60 PhD plant and soil scientists that know how to set up these systems, but it's about the partnership with the local people on practices, the history, how they've overcome prior events, whether it's an earthquake, a drought, a series of floods. They understand the water cycle in the context of their geography, because
I'm going to speed you up because we only have about 7 minutes left. And you find that your 60 PhDs and these illiterate farmers actually have meaningful conversations, and there is two-way learning.
It does take time, but yes, we have a very humble staff, as evidenced by our lack of marketing. We've been so busy in the last 10 years that, we're now finally coming back to tell the story. I think the biggest piece of learning is the social engineering associated with getting that dialogue going and implementing
Thank you,
it
Stephanie.
and
Thank
showing
you,
it.
Stephanie. That social engineering, Willie, that gets me back to the last slide that you showed. It's a package. You cannot cherry pick. But to get back to that specific question, you wanted to get back to what Charles was saying, the Dayak being the best foresters in the known universe.
Yeah, well, first of all, Dayak only are living on Borneo, not on Sumatra.
I'm so sorry. Okay.
That's one point.
You can tell I'm not a specialist there.
He's absolutely right about the non-timber forest products. They have a huge value, but what is the problem now? It is that outsiders have come in and money and the commercial aspect has become much more important for the individuals. And by breaking up the fairness and the trust between the people that are managing these agroforests, the limbo system of the Dayaks and all the Chikau Batik and all the systems that I have also been working with for the last 43 years, they are based upon honesty. And the moment that culture breaks down, that's when they give up, because there's theft of the Kaharu wood, the rattan is stolen, the vanilla, all of them the same problem, the fairness. So you need a fair system and you need transparency, you need control. And that is what the rebuild system is about, providing a fantastic deal for the people, but you stick to the rules. So it's a bit dictatorial, but that is the only way to get back the original way. And the villages that we establish are based upon walking distances, and you come back in the evening to your village. There's only about 200 families, which is about a small size where you do not have the conflicts about religion, where you do not have crime, where you know almost everyone else in the village. And then you have social activities. That coherence is the key to make those natural potentials true and get them into something that can be expressed in dollars.
Thank you, Willie. Fairness. Oliver, how do you sell fairness to investors?
Well, I think we have a real chance here right now. Let me talk a little bit. I know we don't have much time, but let me talk a little bit about a different breed of investors.
1 minute, please, because I'd like to get to the questions from the audience.
That'll be enough. Carbon farming is basically creating a new opportunity to bring everyone to the same table. So what you realize is that we mentioned Unilever, we work with Mars and many other corporations, and Willie mentioned a number of companies he's working with. All these companies have made big commitments in the climate context, and we need to deliver with them. And that provides not only regenerative farming, agroforestry context, but also landscape projects and community projects, the opportunity to deliver all of that together, because none of them individually can do that. So if you look at the carbon farming context, and it brings it back to the topics of soil, carbon sequestration, certification, none of those components can deliver this at a satisfactory level. So if you build an agroforestry production system, it will not be able to deliver an insetting solution to the buyers, a full insetting solution to the buyers of these products. But it can if you bring in forestry.
Stop. We don't have the time. Getting into those questions, Petri Leitonen asks, do you have examples where agroforestry systems are producing wood in sufficient scale for wood product-oriented value chains? I'll answer that question. Yes, there's many. One that you know of in Europe are the Dehesas and the Montados in Iberia. That's where the corks for your wine bottles and your champagne bottles come from the cork oak systems there. All the production is cattle, sheep, and pigs. And you have examples like that all over the world. Glyn Mitchell asks, we need to talk about soils. If the soil is not suitable to support the trees, well, yes, obviously you want a tree that works in that particular soil. I've got a friend in Zambia who's restoring mine tailings in copper mines. That soil is filled with radioactivity and with heavy metals. There's no phosphate, no phosphorus, no nitrogen. It's evil soil. But he's found one tree that can cope with those conditions and slowly grow. And with that tree, you bring everything else back, because once the tree is there, the birds come with their seeds and with their shit and add fertility to the soil. So yes, of course you need to choose the right tree. Jean-Philippe Wassenaar asks, many farmers are operating marginal businesses, earning a living but no return on capital. Yes. Can somebody afford to wait 30 years to make their money? Farmers always face that conundrum between filling your belly now and making an investment in the future. And that's where people like Oliver, Willie, and Stephanie help, because Oliver, Willie, and Stephanie are designing the complex, not just the social systems and the biophysical systems, but also the financial reward systems to make that particular issue work. And that's where the financiers become so important. Because after all, if you look at the Western context, no farmer has a problem going to the bank and borrowing $500,000 to buy a giant tractor, but try to go to the bank to borrow $500,000 to plant some trees, and you'll be looked at as scams because it's unusual, right? So you have to do that. Farmers cannot afford to make too many mistakes. Is this technology ready? Jean-Philippe, the oldest plant that we know of to have been domesticated is an agroforestry tree. Agroforestry was the default way of managing agriculture until we discovered the wonders of artificial fertilizer, well, first of guano, but then of inorganic fertilizers. People have been mixing animals, crop rotations, and trees forever because it was the only way to keep soil fertility going over a long period of time. So yes, I think we can say the technology is ready. Now we have 30 seconds left, so 10 seconds each. Oliver, 10 seconds. What is the last thought you'd like to leave us with?
Just finishing on my last thought. I think the carbon market provides everyone an opportunity to bring all these thoughts.
Carbon market is an opportunity. Thank you, Willie. You're muted. Stephanie.
I would just go back to my comment prior on ecosystem services as well as food and fiber and timber markets together. We have to have.
We need to sell it all together. Winnie, if you unmute yourself, you can have the last word.
Sorry, stupid again. Ethical criteria for accepting projects.
So, carbon plus, ethical criteria, sell everything. Ladies and gentlemen, I know they can't see you, but I want you all to send the vibes of strong applause to a wonderful panel. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your interesting questions. We all wish it had taken longer, but you all have another panel to go to. Thank you very much. Godspeed, and let's make the planet green together. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Patrick, for your inspiring charisma.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we have, Warren says there's another panel starting, so presumably we're not live any longer. Warren, can you confirm? Warren, you're muted.
Yeah, that's right. You're not live in. Yeah, that's correct.
Great. All right, guys.
All right.
Hey,
okay, well done, guys, by the way. Thank you very much for your help. You know, Oliver, I know it was last minute for you, so appreciate your input and look forward to the next one.
And Willie, I really want you to share that presentation with me and the papers about what's happening to the secondary forest. That's fascinating. My understanding is that, all right, the components of the forest may change if the natural regeneration does not allow the old species to come back, but that the forest